Hello and welcome to today's presentation on effective ways to license Microsoft Azure. My name is Karl. I'm a principal licensing consultant here at Version 1. My role at Version 1 is working with our customers to help them understand what their Microsoft effective license position is, helping customers construct licensing solutions for Microsoft technology, be that on-premise or in the cloud. I also do some work around the area of Microsoft contract negotiations, helping customers in particular negotiate large and medium-sized Microsoft enterprise agreements. And then where customers are in that unfortunate position of being audited, I also do some work around the area of audit defense and helping customers successfully navigate the Microsoft audit process effectively. I have 5 years working for Microsoft within the software asset management function there. And for just over the past 11 years, I've been working as an independent Microsoft licensing consultant, and with Version 1 coming up on 3 years. So in today's session, we're going to cover off 3 key areas. The first area we're going to cover off is around understanding the available Azure fulfillment models. We'll talk about how or what are the ways to buy Azure and how to take advantage of those licensing programs. The bulk of today's session is actually going to focus on Azure Hybrid Benefits in particular, because this is one licensing mechanism that gives organizations an opportunity to realize significant cost savings. And then we'll wrap things up by talking about some ongoing cost optimization in Azure, some practical examples on how to do that and how to reduce those Azure consumption costs. Okay, so Azure license fulfillment models. So anybody who's ever purchased Microsoft software will know that there's multiple layers to work through in terms of trying to understand what's the best way to purchase Microsoft technology. On the left hand, you have Microsoft's product licensing terms, so the licensing terms that dictate as to how you can use their technology, be that on-premise or in the cloud. And then on the right-hand side, you have all these different licensing programs that you can utilize to fulfill those different licensing needs that you might have. So it's quite complicated at times to understand the product licensing terms, but then trying to understand the nuances and the differences between the available licensing programs that are out there can add an additional layer of complexity. In some cases, organizations will take the point or the point of least resistance and purchase licenses through a easy to understand licensing vehicle, which can be advantageous at times, but can also throw up some disadvantages or hidden risks. And then there's also, scenarios where there are more complex licensing programs that need a depth of understanding to navigate and evaluate that can actually provide for a range of different benefits that might be otherwise unnoticed. With regards to Azure, and I think Microsoft in general are compressing down the number of licensing programs that are out there. We saw some recent announcements where the Microsoft Open Licensing Program, which is their primary licensing vehicle for organizations with, say, 5 devices up to about 500 devices, is being retired over the coming 12 months. And we're seeing the emergence of new licensing or modern licensing programs from Microsoft to adapt to the needs of organizations as they adopt a more cloud-first strategy. Historically, a lot of the licensing programs that have been out there in the market from Microsoft have been designed primarily for on-premise licensing. And obviously within the cloud, how you can license technology is a lot more dynamic as to how you would license that technology in an on-premise world where things can be quite static. So we've seen quite a raft of changes in terms of how customers can procure Microsoft software, particularly in the cloud over the last number of years in particular. So when we look at Azure specifically, I guess you could break this down into 3 categories. There's direct, which is quite simply where a lot of organizations fall into a position where you take a company credit card or a personal credit card and you hit the Azure portal and you start to consume services from day one on a pay-as-you-go basis. Organizations who might be of a certain size or magnitude might want to step that up a level and engage directly with Microsoft and have a dedicated Microsoft representative and purchase Azure services via a Microsoft customer agreement or an MCA. That's an area where we've seen many organizations transition across from the enterprise agreement program, where they've been of a certain size and magnitude over the last number of months or years, or last year or so. Then you have volume licensing, which a lot of you will be familiar with. Those of you who have purchased Microsoft software, or who primarily purchase the bulk of your Microsoft software through a Microsoft enterprise agreement or enterprise subscription agreement or server and cloud enrollment, will be familiar with this concept of a monetary commit for Azure, recently been changed in name to a prepayment. And essentially that's where organizations would, based on a certain level of forecasting, based on future demand and retrospectively looking at how they were consuming Azure over the previous term, will make a monetary commitment to Microsoft, or a prepayment for Microsoft to Microsoft for Azure services. That's done on an annualized basis, and it is a use it or lose it type model. So, a lot of organizations will want to be careful in terms of how they forecast that requirement. There are some tips and tricks that you can do. You may want to make that prepayment over a 3-year period. So that means that you've got the total length of the duration of a contract, like an enterprise agreement, to consume that prepayment. Or you might want to be a little bit cautious and perhaps just keep the payment relatively low to what you think you will consume, therefore eliminating the risk of potential waste associated with a prepayment that just wasn't really fit for purpose based on what your actual consumption plans ended up looking like. And then the third option is the CSP program. And the Cloud Solution Partner Program is, I guess it's relatively a new entry into the world of Microsoft licensing. It has been around now for a few years, and it's become more and more mature, and it is becoming the default licensing vehicle for a lot of organizations up to a certain size, I would say. Organizations with less than, say, 2,000 or so users would typically fall into this category. We're seeing a transition of a lot of organizations from the enterprise agreement program, for example, where they're just under that threshold, into CSP. Really what CSP gives us versus, say, some of the more traditional licensing programs is this modern licensing concept. It allows you to acquire Azure services on a dynamic basis from a Microsoft partner that will typically be providing some form of managed service to you, or providing some layer of intellectual property around the licenses that they're fulfilling. So CSP shouldn't really be viewed as being a traditional licensing vehicle. It should be viewed as a licensing vehicle that gives you an opportunity to gain access to enhanced support capabilities from a Microsoft partner of a certain level of that has a certain level of capability. There's different flavors in there. There's direct CSP and indirect CSP. You'll often hear customers or Microsoft partners talking about. Direct is basically where the CSP partner will have a direct billing relationship with Microsoft and a direct support relationship with Microsoft, whereas indirect, you'll see there's generally a distributor in the middle, a cloud distributor, that will have the billing relationship with Microsoft, and in turn the distributor will have that billing relationship with the partner and then to the customer. So there's a couple of layers there in the indirect model that aren't normally associated with the indirect model. I guess from a direct perspective, having that direct engagement with a partner that has a direct line into Microsoft can provide advantages, but that's not to say that there aren't capable partners in the indirect space, and they've chosen for various reasons to go down that route. So which program is right for you? Really, it depends on the level of consumption, the size of your organization, your willingness to try and attain or gain access to concessions from Microsoft, or even at the partner level. One trap that we often see many organizations fall into is that they start to dabble with Azure and simply start to put their consumption on a company credit card and through the direct model. Within that model, there's no negotiation. There's a single payment that is rolling on a pay-as-you-go basis each month. There's no real interaction. Whereas with the volume licensing options, perhaps with the enterprise agreement, by having a large monetary commitment or prepayment perhaps in your enterprise agreement, that may provide advantages in terms of your overall negotiation strategy with Microsoft and what that might bring in terms of discounts for other more strategic products. In the CSP space, generally the licensing component is incorporated into a broader managed service, and having that combination of licensing and managed service can give customers the opportunity to use that economy of scale to attain more preferential pricing. So in that scenario, you're looking at working with a partner to try and optimize perhaps the cost of the license, taking into account the overall solution that that partner is providing to your organization. So that can be, I would say in terms of value, CSP can actually provide customers with better value than some of the other programs that are out there, but that's not always necessarily the case. But I think the big thing that a lot of orgs fall into that trap is just the direct putting a credit card in there and just letting it spin and not really looking at the alternatives and what are the economic benefits of those alternatives. So Azure Hybrid Benefit, an introduction. So what is it? So it's a licensing benefit. That's the first thing to call out. It's linked to active software assurance. So no active software assurance on applicable products, then you can go off and have a cup of coffee for the next few slides because this just won't apply. So the key thing here is to have active software assurance attached to your Windows Server licenses or your SQL Server licensing estate. What does it do? So a couple of things to call out. Azure compute fees are still applicable, although they're at a reduced rate, which I'll talk about in a second. There are consumption fees still applicable for things like backup storage and other resources. So it isn't an all-you-can-eat buffet. Sometimes people hear hybrid benefit and they think it's straight up like for like, and you're going to get everything for free. That's not necessarily the case, but there are some great cost savings here. And how is that done? Well, I guess the key driver behind those cost savings is that it reduces or removes the need to factor in the Windows Server and SQL Server software fees in Azure. I always consider it to be a great cloud licensing pathway for organizations. In many cases, and I'll get into some of the detail on this in the presentation today, it does include dual rights, which can be really advantageous for customers who want to retain one foot in the on-premise world and one foot in the cloud, or they want to dabble or start to slowly increase their level of utilization of Azure over a period of time, while still maintaining a relatively large or medium-sized presence of Windows Server and SQL Server in their on-premise estate. And then recently, Microsoft made some announcements where Red Hat and SUSE entitlement can be included within the program, and that's dependent on the type of subscriptions you have for those products. But again, another opportunity for you to use third-party products to reduce consumption costs in Azure. Windows Server and hybrid benefits. So the first topic we're going to get into a bit more detail around is the Windows Server operating system. There's two flavors to this: Azure VMs in multi-tenanted environments and Azure dedicated hosts. So again, I'll keep repeating this one. It depends on the presence of active software assurance being attached to your Windows Server Standard or Windows Server Data Center licenses. For many organizations, you might have what Microsoft call the core infrastructure suite. And the core infrastructure suite is a combination of the Windows Server operating system and System Center combined into this bundle SKU called the core infrastructure suite, which you have a standard and a data center flavor of. So if it's the standalone OS that you have, or if it's the core infrastructure suite that you have, the same hybrid benefits apply. Obviously, there's the added advantage of System Center components in the core infrastructure suite versus the standalone Windows Server license. As mentioned previously, so what does it do? It allows you to avoid Windows Server OS related fees. But I guess the key driver behind the cost savings that you can realize relate to being able to substitute the Windows Server based rate for the compute rate, which is basically a Linux hourly rate. We estimate the cost savings are between about 25 and 42%. You do have to take into account that you've got to continue active software assurance. So without active software assurance, the benefit goes away, and that's obviously something you need to be cognizant of from a compliance point of view. And I'll talk about some of the compliance risks later on in this presentation. Cost savings, again, the hourly rate is a key driver behind that, but there's some other factors at play, particularly around the types of machines that you use. Typically, the machines that have a higher specification, better processing power, and so forth, tend to have a slightly more expensive OS cost associated with them. So by assigning our hybrid benefits into those types of into that profile of machine, or those types of machines, can help increase those cost savings. Downgrade rights apply, right? So any previous version of Windows Server that's supported by Azure is also covered by the Azure Hybrid Benefit. So let's look at what you get in a little bit more detail. So Azure VMs. So these are in a multi-tenanted environment. First thing to call out is that each licensed core maps to a single vCPU or vCore. And here are the grants and how they break down. So if you have, say, for example, 16 Windows Server Data Center or standard core licenses, you gain access to the rights to have 2 Windows Server VMs, Azure VMs, should I say, with 8 or less cores each. Or you could have 1 Windows Server VM with 16 cores in total. Here's the catch: you can't have, say, for example, 4 VMs with a lower number of cores. The maximum number of VMs that you can have for those 16 cores is 2 VMs. So you couldn't split it out and have a whole bunch of small VMs with really low core counts. The Microsoft product terms state that you've got to have a maximum of 2, where you could have 1. Now you can do things like stacking licenses on top of each other. So where you've got, individual Azure VMs that have relatively high resource requirements, you can look to stack those core licenses on top of each other. So if you had a 32 core box, for example, you can stack the 216 core packs on top of each other, or multiple 8 cores or 2 core packs. But again, the big thing is to watch out for is that you can't split the number of machines out into a lower number of VMs. The Windows Server edition, or data center edition, should I say, includes dual use rights. So this is a really great benefit. So if I've got Windows Server running in my on-premise environment, which the vast majority of organizations at this stage, based on the level of virtualization that takes place in many organizations, unless there's a specific need not to have it, will have Windows Server Data Center licensing at the host level. So you're licensing your physical host for an unlimited number of virtualized instances on the physical estate. With Azure Hybrid Benefit, you can take those Windows Server Data Center licenses with active software assurance, and you can bring that benefit to Azure, and you can still continue to use those licenses on premise. So there's dual use rights, if you want to call it, which is really advantageous for customers who are looking to either reduce their cost or start to increase their footprint in Azure. Windows Server Standard is slightly different. The Windows Server Standard licensing terms state that you can either run the software on-premise or in the cloud. Now, what that looks like is that you've got a couple of caveats in there. So for example, if you move it to Azure, you've got 180 days of concurrent use rights. So during that initial migration period, you can run that software in both environments, so in Azure or on premise. There are ongoing 90-day reassignment rights. So volume licensing terms dictate that you have 90 days to reassign licenses. So you could move them back after a 90-day period, and for whatever reason. But I would assume that most organizations, if moving them to the cloud, that change is going to be permanent. So I think that the only real lack of flexibility on Windows Server Standard is the lack of dual use rights. When it comes to Azure dedicated hosts, again, the benefit is dependent on the availability of Windows Server Data Center core licenses or core infrastructure data center suite licenses, for that matter, with active software assurance. So this is a little bit like, how you would license those products on premise. Each time you license the actual physical host with the correct number of core licenses, and a minimum number of 16 core licenses required, you gain access to unlimited virtualization rights on that dedicated host that's licensed with the appropriate number of core licenses for data center. There is one big caveat here, is that the dual use rights that I discussed in your Azure VMs that apply for Windows Server Data Center, that doesn't apply in this particular scenario here. So there's a one-time 180-day concurrent use right benefit there during that migration period. But after those licenses with software assurance and the hybrid benefit has been applied, essentially those licenses have to remain in the on those Azure dedicated hosts indefinitely. You don't have the rights to run those data center licenses on those dedicated hosts at the same time as running those licenses on top of physical hosts within your on-premise environment. So next we're going to talk a little bit about Azure Benefit for SQL Server. So many different flavors to this one. There's first one is Azure VMs running SQL Server. The benefit can also be applied to Azure dedicated host running SQL Server, a little bit like the previous example for Windows Server. It can also be applied to Azure SQL Server Database and Azure Data Factory SQL Server integration services. Again, sound like I'm repeating myself here, but software assurance is key. So each Windows Server standard or enterprise core license that you currently have within your environment with active software assurance has hybrid benefits. One caveat to add here, some of you customers might not necessarily have Windows Server core, should I say SQL Server core-based licensing. You may have SQL Server and CAL licensing, and hybrid benefit doesn't apply to those types of licenses. There are alternatives for that, and I'll get onto that in the later stages of the presentation. Again, what it does, hybrid benefit reduces or avoids SQL Server license included fees. As I mentioned, there's multiple deployment models here, IaaS and PaaS included. Cost savings we estimate can be as much as about 20%. You can enhance those cost savings by stacking the SQL Server hybrid benefit on top of the Windows Server hybrid benefit. There's no limitation in terms of doing that. And then also enhanced product use rights for failover and disaster recovery can add further cost saving benefits with regards to SQL Server by bringing that hybrid benefit to Azure. Storage and other Azure related costs still apply, so it's unfortunately still isn't an all you can eat buffet. There is still some costs there that have to be factored in, but albeit your overall consumption costs should be reduced by utilizing the benefit itself. So first of all, let's look at Azure VMs running SQL Server. So this again applies to SQL Server standard or core licenses. For every 4 or more SQL Core licenses, you have the rights for the same edition and any edition within an Azure VM that has the same number or fewer vCPUs. So as of January 2021, and I always caveat these things by saying, the rules are always subject to change. But currently, if say, for example, you have a SQL Server Enterprise Core license in your on-premise environment, for each SQL Server Enterprise core that you have, you will gain access to 1 vCPU core on a Azure VM. For each SQL Server Enterprise core, if you want to convert those licenses into SQL Server standard virtual machines, 1 enterprise core equals 4 vCPUs for SQL Server standard. One thing to call out is that obviously each virtual machine has a minimum core requirement of 4. Then if we flip the model and we look at SQL Server standard, for every SQL Server standard you have 1 core of currently, you'll gain access to 1 vCPU. And then to flip the model on its head, for every SQL Server standard, if you apply 4 of those SQL Server standard core licenses, that will give you a SQL Server Enterprise. Will give you 1 SQL Server Enterprise vCPU. One thing that's quite useful here in the context of Azure is that you have failover rights, pretty good failover rights. So there's no SQL Server license fees, should I say, for passive servers or a third failover server used for DUR purposes. Dual use rights. So this is where the goalposts slightly shift, and that the dual use rights that you would have had associated with your Windows Server licenses as discussed previously, particularly for the Data Center Edition, there are no dual use rights for SQL Server when using this hybrid benefit. There is that one-time 180-day rule around the migration piece itself, but after that period of time, the licenses, you don't have the rights to continue using those on premise and using them at the same time in Azure. Azure dedicated host running SQL Server, so very similar to Windows Server, this one. And very similar to how you would traditionally license SQL Server for high density virtualization of your SQL Server environment. So again, by often describing it as licensing from the bottom up, or appropriately licensing the number of physical cores on a dedicated host, you will gain access to an unlimited number of VMs running SQL Server. So no different to how you would license SQL Server on premise. That right transitions across, obviously just transitioning it to Azure dedicated hosts versus on-prem hosts. Again, and this extends to the Azure VMs running SQL Server as well, is that there is extended support updates granted for SQL Server, which can be quite useful when you consider there's still quite a lot of customers out there running SQL Server 2008 and in some cases some older versions, but I guess the 2008 cohort are really applicable to this benefit, and that can potentially reduce if you've invested in ESUs or extended security updates for SQL Server independently in the recent past. They're quite expensive, and this gives you an opportunity to manage out that cost. Having said that, many organizations, when they're going to all the trouble of migrating workloads to Azure, it may be more advantageous to actually use it as an opportunity to modernize some of those workloads versus bringing legacy workloads to the cloud. Enhanced failover benefits are there versus regular SQL pay-as-you-go. The concurrency rule around the 180-day on-premise migration rights are also present. So there's that one-time right to migrate across over a 180-day period where you can use both sets of licensing. And again, this can be combined with the Azure benefit for Windows Server. So you can reduce your cost further by combining the Azure hybrid benefit for Windows Server on top of this benefit to get down those costs considerably. The next flavor we're going to talk about is Azure SQL Server Database, which is Microsoft's multi-tenant relational, should I say, database service. The benefit again applies to standard or enterprise, and how it applies, it depends again on the profile of service that you're using. So is it general purpose, business critical, or hyperscale? So in the slide here, just to quickly run through these, you'll see SQL Server Enterprise. So for each enterprise core that I currently have within a general purpose service, I will get 1 core equals 4 vCores. For business critical, 1 core equals 1 vCore. And then for hyperscale, it reverts back again to for every 1 core license I have, I get 4 vCores within the service. SQL Server Standard, not too dissimilar. For each 1 core of the general purpose, I get 1 core. Business critical is a 4-to-1, and then hyperscale is a 1-to-1. So again, a great opportunity to leverage that on-prem investment to start using these services. And then Azure Data Factory. So Azure Data Factory SQL Server integration services. Standard or enterprise licenses, core-based licenses with SA, recurring theme, still applies. And what you get essentially is for the enterprise is a 1-to-1. If you want to use standard, for every enterprise, 1 core equals 4 cores. And then, as you can see in the slides, when we flip that on its head, SQL Server Standard gives an equivalency for 1-to-1 for the standard edition. And then when running enterprise, 4 cores equals 1 vCore. So what about license mobility? So many of you will be familiar with this license mobility concept, and effectively this is a software assurance benefit for SQL Server and many other Microsoft Server products, primarily on the productivity side of things. Many of you will be familiar with it for SharePoint, Exchange, and so on. And what it does, we talk about it specifically in the context of SQL, is it allows you to reassign SQL licenses to a vendor's shared services. That can include Azure running in an IaaS type scenario, or a AWS EC2, so a shared tenancy type environments. With this type of deployment model, you don't have the same flexibility as you gain access to with Azure Hybrid Benefits. So the 180-day dual use rights don't apply. So if you're doing any migration at scale, that's going to be on a permanent basis. the licenses have to either remain on-prem or the licenses have to be in the cloud. So, that could potentially result in the doubling up of licensing fees if you were to follow the rules effectively. There's no core grants for PaaS options such as SQL Server Database and Azure Data Factory workloads. I would say there's a layer of administration tracking this. That's not to say there isn't administration associated with license mobility, but there is a administration layer getting the license mobility benefit verified with Microsoft before the software should be, in theory, deployed. And then failover rights are limited. It would consult with the current product terms just to ensure that you're clear as to what those failover rights are, because there is a risk that you may fall afoul of the licensing terms. And then again, there is one added benefit here, I would say, is that SQL Server and SQL Server Cal licenses can apply in this scenario here. So if you've got a lot of SQL servers that aren't licensed by core and that you've gone the Server Cal model, license mobility actually can be quite advantageous in that it allows you to bring those licenses to public cloud and Azure IaaS or AWS EC2, for example. I think a lot of customers, though, will confuse hybrid benefit with this particular benefit, and really they are similar in their overall concept in terms of bringing licenses to a third-party cloud or to Azure. But I would say that the level of enhanced benefits included with the hybrid benefit definitely supersedes what you will gain access to as a part of the license mobility benefit. And I think in terms of costs, and when you model this from a costing point of view, the advantages from a cost perspective of hybrid benefit versus license mobility tend to be a lot more. So worth looking at the two, but I would say hybrid benefit will ultimately win out on that front. So tracking it. So these are some of the observations I've had from working with customers. I think customers fall into a number of categories. The first is that they just never enable the benefit. So it's sitting there flying under the radar, hasn't been used, and is wasting the company money based on the fact they've got some or a lot of workloads now in Azure, but they haven't assigned any of that Azure benefit. Two would be where organizations have got it optimized, got it implemented, or they're using it, should I say, but it's poorly optimized. So that's like somebody has just gone, we have hybrid, yeah, we'll just tick that box and off we go, and we stick it against these 5 machines here. But there's never really any thought in terms of the types or profiles of machines that it's being assigned to. Are they on 24/7? Are they assigning them to test and dev machines, for example? Are they assigning them to machines that have a low compute requirements, or they're low spec machines? The third category would be customers they've implemented, but they haven't sufficient governance in place to track where the benefit is enabled. And then we've also got a cohort of customers that I would say follow best practice and are optimizing the benefit on an ongoing basis. So those are those customers who've integrated their software asset management program with their technical service delivery to ensure that there's a licensing overlay on top of how they're currently using the technology, and making sure that that's been optimized and that they're staying in compliance on an ongoing basis. There's a couple of tools that you can use to track and manage that. Azure Policy, Azure Alerts, and tagging are great mechanisms to leverage to mitigate against some of the risks taking place, and using automation to mitigate against the risk of poorly managing hybrid benefit. Because there are risks, it is a trust-based model. And I think it's really important to call out that if there isn't sufficient governance in place, organizations will fall into a compliance trap. Right now, Microsoft don't necessarily have built-in compliance to this benefit. It is a ticky box type exercise, I almost describe it. And so if it's not correctly tracked, there is a risk that your organization could fall afoul of the licensing terms. So some organizations might have a disconnect between the software asset management team and those that are actually deploying and managing the technology. And so that benefit could be enabled without the necessary governance to understand exactly what is it that we actually have benefits for. But then also over time, as we see more organizations adopt Azure at scale, there is always the risk that you have creep within your organization, and hybrid benefits are out there being applied to machines that don't necessarily have the underlying benefit available to them. So it's really important that organizations take stock, put in place the necessary steps to ensure that they're automating the tracking and managing of this potential risk, but that they also have some form of licensing overlay and governance to make sure that that as how the technology is being used or how the benefit is being used is in line with Microsoft's current licensing terms. Because licensing terms, they change on a frequent basis, so it's really important that you understand exactly what they look like today, because oftentimes how you license a technology 2 years ago can be completely different to how a technology is licensed today. The risk of this, it's an interesting one. Customers, will Microsoft view this as a potential hot sweet spot or hotspot for license compliance audits in the future? Quite possibly. It could be an opportunity for Microsoft to perhaps integrate more enhanced built-in compliance controls, which with a flick of a switch overnight could leave many organizations exposed from a financial point of view, where this benefit needs to be correctly tied back to a license type. And then also, if faced with an audit, I think there's a risk that if organizations have inadvertently or through malicious intent drawn down on this benefit, it could be questionable. Would you be faced with retrospective payments for hybrid benefit associated with machines that shouldn't have had that benefit in the first place? So, worst case scenario, you could have been underpaying for your Azure for 2 or 3 years and getting a 30% discount based on the inclusion of the benefit. Could Microsoft look and say, retrospectively, you shouldn't have had that discount, and so you've got to pay for that balance over time? It's not beyond the realms of possibility that that risk could exist within your organization if the necessary governance isn't in place. So tracking and managing. So I guess there's 3 kind of key steps to this: discovery and identify. So looking at your Azure bills, trying to understand where hybrid benefit has been enabled or if it's not been enabled. So having that understanding is key. The Azure portal is obviously a good reference point to understand your VMs that are out there and where hybrid benefit has been assigned. Microsoft's Azure cost management tools are always increasing in capability, and again give you good insight in terms of where hybrid benefit has been applied, and allow you then to conduct your own exercise to understand how does that tie back with your entitlement. Other in-house SAM tools. So some of you organizations out there may have invested in software asset management tools that have good cloud capabilities or cloud management capabilities. And if so, that another good reference point to understand where those machines might exist. And then volume licensing entitlement. So the benefit is only applicable to customers that have software assurance attached to specific products like Windows Server, Core Infrastructure, and SQL Server. So by having a good understanding of what your volume licensing entitlement looks like and the software assurance benefits that are attached to those licenses and when that expires is key to understand what's available to use within the organization from a hybrid benefits perspective. The second component is analyzing, reconciling, and resolving. So I would say that oftentimes there's a disconnect between those who are in the trenches configuring machines, deploying and managing machines on an ongoing basis, with those who have the licensing expertise. And in many organizations, some of those licensing expertise might not necessarily exist. And if they don't exist, always worthwhile looking to try and bring those in independently from an external source. But it's key that those 2 skill sets are aligned. Understanding your effective license position is key to understand exactly what it is you're entitled to use. Validating what you're entitled to use against Microsoft's product terms is also key. As I mentioned, they change on a frequent basis, so it's important that organizations stay on top of what those changes look like. There should be insights around how the benefits can be better optimized, right? Are they assigned to the right profile of machine or not? Or is there an opportunity to reassign the benefit elsewhere within the organization? Or have Microsoft changed the rules to your benefit and there's enhanced benefits there now that could be better utilized on new services or whatnot? And then obviously you want to understand where the license compliance risks might exist. And by understanding that, then you have a better opportunity to control those risks and the financial exposure associated with those risks on your terms. And what does that all lead to? Well, I guess that leads to being able to redeem the hybrid benefit where it's not being correctly or where it's not being utilized today, repurpose it where it could be better used within the organization, or removing it where, not through malicious intent or inadvertently it's been assigned to machines where it shouldn't have been, or where perhaps, as we said, it can be repurposed and used elsewhere within your estate. Automation is key. So using things like Azure policies and Azure alerts, and tagging, having those capabilities to implement, using those capabilities to implement a certain level of automation is key, because it's a moving target. It's not just a one and done type exercise. So you want to try and implement as much automation around preventing the risk from taking place in the first place through policy, but also putting in place perhaps alerts and using tagging to identify where risks might be taking place, as a part of your analysis and reconciliation process that you should be undertaking on a regular basis. So some top tips around optimization. So as I said, verify your license position, analyze your VM usage, catalog best fit hybrid rights and their associated targets, and then redeem, track, and manage the benefit. They're the kind of the key themes I would say to customers to take into account when it comes to making best use of Azure Hybrid Benefit. Using the benefit in tandem with your machines that are continually running is key. So identify where machines need to be on by the 24/7 so that you can get the best bang for your buck in terms of aligning the benefit. Where you have situations where you might have the lights out for a certain time of the day, or they're off for periods of the week, or perhaps their machines that are off at specific periods in a month or a quarter, assigning in a benefit to those machines is probably not the optimized way of assigning the benefit. Assigning the benefit to more expensive or higher performance Azure VMs. I touched on this one previously. So OS costs are typically higher for machines that are more highly spec'd. So assigning the benefit into machines that are of a higher specification can provide additional cost savings. Leveraging other mechanisms to license development and test type environments or non-production environments. Some key examples of this would be the dev test benefit for organizations that have an enterprise agreement. That's an add-on that can be assigned to users that have Visual Studio licenses, and can provide significant cost savings associated with non-production Azure requirements. Or for organizations who just have standalone Visual Studio licenses, there are a certain level of credits provided for as a part of the Visual Studio program that you can use within Azure. So having a look at those benefits and leveraging those benefits for non-production purposes is key. So often we see many organizations assign licenses, full fat commercial software to non-production environments when there's an alternative out there that can be significantly lower in cost. And then there's obviously the Azure free account that's out there for hobbyists or those who want to have a play around. That can be some benefit in using that as well. Combining it with other techniques that I would say that are out there, so reserved instances, so making a long-term commitment to Microsoft for Azure services through reserved instances is a great opportunity, or provides a great opportunity to reduce overall cost. In doing that, you want to box clever. Assigning reserved instances straight out of the blocks can be risky sometimes. We have seen situations where customers sign up to reserved instances and then find that actually they probably overcommitted in terms of what it is they needed. So other techniques that can be used in place can be this concept of turning on and off the lights at opportune times in a working week or a quarter, and when combining the use of reserved instances, lights on, lights off, development and test type models for licensing, using leveraging the Azure Hybrid Benefit. When all combined, these are some really great techniques that can allow you to squeeze cost out of your Azure monthly consumption fees. And then for those who've got extended security support, the SQL example that I mentioned in the presentation gives you a great opportunity to eliminate that cost if you've got those ESUs subscribed to on a standalone basis. Moving those SQL Server VMs into Azure can mitigate against that rather expensive cost, I would say. So that about wraps things up for today's webinar. Just a plug for our Cloud Economics Assessment engagement. This is, I would say, a foundation level assessment that's really great for organizations who are trying to get their head around what are the monetary costs of moving to Azure versus remaining on-premise. what are my readiness levels and what are my migration pathways for moving to Azure. So it's a low touch foundation assessment that we recommend for customers who are in the early stages of planning for an Azure migration, and provides a great foundation or a stepping stone for customers who are looking to formulate a more detailed business case for migrating to Azure. As a part of this session today, we also offer a remote consultation with one of our software asset management consultants. That will be either myself or some of the other members of the team, where we can talk through some of your current goals, objectives, and challenges around Microsoft licensing. Happy to extend that invite to talk about all Microsoft technologies and not just to Azure. But having attended today's presentation, if there are any specific areas that you're looking to gain clarity on, please do reach out to us. We'd be delighted to give that remote consultation, as I'm sure we'll be able to provide some really useful insights that can help you drive down cost, help you manage risk, and help strategically plan for any new Microsoft technology deployments that you may have. So thank you again for attending today's webinar. We look forward to seeing you on our upcoming webinars on all things Microsoft licensing in the future.